Hello and welcome to the Arise interview. 60 glorious minutes of multifaceted discussion where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolo. Coming up in the next hour, how the internet and the digital economy is changing Africa, mostly for the better, but sometimes with negative consequences, with penetration on the continent so patchy and the big tech giants like Google and Facebook coming in to build up internet infrastructure. Are we seeing a new form of digital colonization? We'll hear from a panel of experts discussing the upside and the downside of Africa's digital revolution in a moment. Now, internet penetration remains patchy, with some countries surging ahead with the use of the internet and technology to boost communications and their economies, whilst others are struggling to embrace the digital revolution. But with Africa predicted to have 600 million internet users by the year 2025, who will gain most from Africa's online growth? Will it be the foreign technology giants amassing personal data, or citizens who now have a voice like never before, along with enhanced communications and economic activity, or governments controlling the flow of information and even shutting down the internet as they have done in recent months in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia and Sudan? Well, in a moment, we'll hear from our panel of digital and journalistic experts. But first, here's a look at the benefits of the internet and the advantages of getting on board the digital wagon in a world where Africa looks like the promised land to the so-called conquerors of the unconnected world.
This is about us. All of us. Right now, a couple billion of us have access to the internet, and amazing things have come from it. So what happens when the rest of us get access?
The internet has become a basic necessity of life. 3 billion world citizens are now online, and plans are in the pipeline for the other 4 billion. Because everyone has to get on board. The big tech corporations are ambitious to expand the internet to grow their markets. Google wants to create a shell of balloons around the planet.
Imagine it. For the first time in history, humanity firing on all cylinders. Everyone, everywhere.
Facebook, their competitor, is experimenting with drones over remote areas. They also offer a free app for people who do have smartphones but can't afford mobile internet.
Our plan is to make basic internet services affordable so that everyone with a phone can join the knowledge economy.
To all these conquerors of the unconnected world, Africa looks like the promised land. It's still the continent with the lowest number of internet connections, but also the place where the biggest progress can be made.
Well, for more on all that, I'm joined now in the studio by the ICT consultant, Femi Adebo, who's also CEO of Comnavig, a company that provides advisory services on a broad range of ICT genres. In a moment, we'll also be joined by the high-tech and cyberspace technologist, Charles Emehel. He's on his way as we speak. We're also joined by the international journalist and African affairs analyst, Lindsay Barrett. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for coming in. And I'll start with you, Lindsay, because I remember reporting for the BBC out of Nigeria and West Africa in the early 90s. God, I've revealed. Okay, in the early, and there was telex at the time, yes, and very few landlines. Then all of a sudden you had these huge mobile phones, and that improved communications dramatically. How different is it now in Africa with the growth of the internet? It's like totally different worlds from those days of yore.
Well, actually, Charles, you're remembering great times. But, you know, the beginning was the introduction of the computer. First, the desktops that made it possible for you to communicate direct and stop going down to Marina, to Nitel, to fight for space.
Yep, absolutely.
And then when the laptops came, it was an incredible change. you could sit in your hotel room or in your bedroom or wherever you were and send out your news. So communication became more personal in some ways, but also became more adventurous. You could, you could actually tell your story very simply and not have to depend on external technology. You became part of the operator. And when that happened, we noticed that one of the important things about the reporting was that you could be less controlled or less censored in what you did and said and passed on. So the advent of the internet was really what carried that technology forward. And today, of course, we are now talking to each other rather than institutionalized reporting.
Absolutely. An absolutely gigantic leap. And let me bring in Femi Adebo, the CEO of Comnovig. How would you say the internet has changed in your lifetime? Many people hardly, I mean, it is fair to say, hardly remember a time before this digital age.
It's been probably one of the most, if not the single most transformational event, if you like, of the past couple of decades, because it's totally broken down the barriers of collaboration between humans. It's broken down the barriers of communication. But of late as well, it's introduced a very concerning trend. I mean, that is of weaponization, if you like, of false information. It's quite interesting. I remember what your chairman said to me about probably 10 years ago. Yes, about 10 years ago. Such a visionary, actually. At the beginning of the internet, I said, Uncle Nduka, this is going to wipe all you guys out of business and this and that. And he said, no. He said, human beings being human beings will abuse it. And eventually people are going to search for a trusted source of information. And they're going to come back to the conventional,
traditional way.
Because somebody takes responsibility for the information. Right now, it's just as forwarded, and it goes. And it's dangerous. It's got the potential for war. It's got the potential for societal breakdown as well. So internet's been very good in terms of economic velocity, collaboration, ability to support small-scale businesses online or what have you. But we are now seeing a very dangerous trend that puts governments on the spot to make the decision between free speech and, should we say censorship? Because
that's a very good point.
Because it's a dangerous thing to left untreated. Yeah.
That's a very important point, and we're going to get into it later in the program. But let me bring you back in, Lindsay Barrett, because in addition to changing the way people think about information, I'm just following on what Femi Adebo said there. The internet, it's also changed and almost eliminated government monopoly of information. I mean, things like the Ministry of Information have become virtually redundant, haven't they?
Well, not really. They have tried to take charge in some parts and to use the internet to their advantage. But what has happened is that governments often find themselves being driven by public opinion rather than public opinion waiting on government's ideas, as was the old form. In the past, governments declared an ideological viewpoint and asked people to take it during the independence movement and things like that. Now it's the other way around. Government always seems to be trying to catch up with the public. And we're seeing an even more interesting trend as in America, where the president has become the #1 Twitter.
Absolutely.
You know,
He's the king of the Twitterati.
and what he's doing is listening to the people and trying to drive their...
And in some ways, to buttress the point that you're making, it underscores the importance of the internet, because you could argue that that's how he was able to bypass the conventional means of communication and reach the people directly and secure victory at the elections.
That is what has happened. And now we're looking at a coming election in which the internet may be even more important.
Right. We've got a few more minutes just before we have to take a break. But let me ask you this, Femi Adebo. As I said, we're going to talk more about all this government and monopoly and what you talked about, the sort of the issue of potential censorship. But an awful lot of business is conducted online at the moment, isn't it? I mean, a lot of banks, for instance, have moved a lot of their customers online, so you don't have to go to a branch anymore and stand in line for hours on end. So to that extent, business is becoming more dependent on the internet.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of small-scale businesses, I mean, the big businesses, it's mandatory to be digitally up-to-date in a sense. But if you look at channels like Instagram and what have you, a lot of business goes on there. I mean, I looked at the figures the other day. We spent, year before the last, we spent about $5 billion on just data.
Right.
Last year, we spent...
When you say we?
Nigeria, for example, Nigeria. We spent almost $6 billion US dollars on just data. Of course, the difficulties, the granularity of knowing what is being done, you know, what quantum of that is productive endeavor and what quantum of it is...
Yeah, that's another good point.
You know, is music, dance.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's
even
wrong. Even
online dating.
I mean, porn and
gambling.
You know, and all sorts of funny videos that don't really add...
We call it the underbelly of the internet.
But when you talk about an economy that says, oh, we're struggling and what have you, and you're still hearing such figures, you know, it boggles the mind, quite frankly.
No, absolutely. And let's not also forget, Lindsay, mobile telephony, which is something that, again, I mean, I want to establish these things before we move into to really sort of to critically examine it. But I mean, mobile telephony has become a tremendous business on its own, along with businesses that have sprung from that, including things like mobile money, and it's allied to transactions, mobile lending, all of that.
And it's really changed the nature of our conduct of daily experience. It's remarkable because, as the gentleman was saying, when you hear that on data Nigerians spend $6 billion, and you think of how much is not being done in Nigeria, tells you that the life is changing.
But also the potential for growth is enormous, isn't it?
Humongous, absolutely. But it's got to, you see, technology accelerates the conduct of a society. It doesn't actually, it's a tool, it's an enabler. I mean, it's shaping it now with artificial intelligence and all these other more intelligent forms of technology. But really, technology is an enabler. So you really need to still go back to the orientation of that society, the inclinations of that society. Otherwise, the technology is just going to help you propagate
That's a good point. I'll ask you to hold that thought. We'll be back to this. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our discussion about the implications of Africa's digital revolution. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyagolu. So beyond the benefits that can accrue to users from the internet, what about digital rights in Africa? You might remember these pictures and the chance of revolution in Khartoum that forced Omar al-Bashir from power in Sudan 3 months ago. But not long ago, after it all started, the government shut down the internet in an attempt to strangle the protest movement and almost at the same time snuff out the country's nascent digital economy, as one British journalist put it. And so the debate around digital rights in Africa is continuing. Recently, there was a digital rights bill in Nigeria that was passed by the National Assembly, but President Buhari decided not to sign it into law. We'll talk about that with our expert panel in a moment, but first, here's a clip from that debate on digital rights in the Nigerian parliament.
To move that a bill for an act to provide for the protection of human rights online, to protect internet users in Nigeria from the infringement of their fundamental freedoms and to guarantee application of human rights for users of digital platforms and further related matters be read a second time. I so move, Mr. Speaker.
As a Speaker, I stand to support the bill proposed by Dr. Ujama. I so support.
There are quite a number of international documents and charters that Nigeria as a nation subscribes to as a member of the International Committee of Nations that seeks to make the access to and freedom on the internet a right of citizens. The United Nations Human Rights Council in 2012 adopted a new resolution on the promotion, protection and enjoyment of human rights on the internet. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, recognizing the African Charter on Human and People's Rights of 1981, the Windhoek Declaration on Promotion on an Independent and Pluralistic African Press of 1991, the African Charter on Broadcasting of 2001, the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression in Africa of 2002, and the African Platform on Access to Information Declaration of 2011, and the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection of 2014, advocates for openness, internet access and affordability, and freedom of information.
And that's the Nigerian parliament there debating digital rights. That video courtesy of Oak TV. And with me in the studio, the ICT consultant, Femi Adebo, who's also CEO of Comnavig, a company that provides advisory services on a broad range of ICT genres. I'm also glad to say that the high-tech and cyberspace technologist Charles Emehelu has joined us in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. And the international journalist and African affairs analyst, Lindsay Barrett, is still with us. And I'll begin again with you, Lindsay. How crucial was the internet in the Sudan uprising? You and I discussed Sudan many, many times, and I'm curious to know how much people were relying on the internet during those protests.
Well, in the early days of the uprising, the internet was absolutely crucial. The exchange of opinions was driving the process. But also, it kept the international audience fully aware of what was going on there. And that played a crucial part in actually getting al-Bashir off balance, so to speak. But then we wonder what happened when the succeeding authorities seemed to realize that this was a danger to them, and they tried. I don't think they really succeeded, because in blocking the internet, they now became parias themselves.
Absolutely.
You know? So even the process of trying to control the internet has become a danger for authoritarian
Yes,
governments.
and that's a good point. And Femi Adebo, you were talking about this earlier, the whole idea of control and censorship. Here we have an internet that gave journalists and activists and citizens the chance to report on the situation. It empowered them to counter government propaganda. They used audio, they used video as a way of sharing stories, verifying announcements, all that sort of thing. And WhatsApp, for instance, was very important because it has end-to-end encryption, so they could use it to mobilize and disseminate information in a very secure manner. What then were they able to achieve, was the government able to achieve by trying to shut that internet down? Essentially, it took the people back to an analog age, because I understand they had to go on buses and rely on face-to-face communication and all of that.
Absolutely, because if you remember the Arab Spring, the internet was, well, it was basically fundamental in the success of the Arab Springs. And I think governments realized very quickly that this is a channel that helps people. They can mobilize thought very, very quickly and then back up on action. So it's a threat in that sense to constituted authority, to the extent that that constituted authority is a repressive one. Because if it isn't,
Yes,
quite frankly,
that's a
it shouldn't
good
be an
point.
issue.
Yeah.
However, if you notice again the trajectory of discourse, political discourse across the world, even in Europe, in America, it's now so divisive. You're either, there's no balance, there's no center. It's either you hate this guy or you like this guy. You notice as well, elections are now contested post-elections across the world. So again, the internet becomes a risk in that sense because it can become a rallying point for weaponization of ideologies or narratives. So it becomes who has the more resources. Now there are specialists you can go to who would again nuance based on your own bias bunkers. So you could go to Google at times and type a result, and type, say, for example, a country. And three of us could type that same thing and we'll get three different results based on
That's a very good point.
bias,
On the
our
data,
safety,
they've
they've
essentially
established.
picked up
So they
from
think,
you.
okay, he's probably looking at holidays.
Yes,
It will
yes.
tell you something about a nice result there. This country has a nice result. He's political. It serves you something else. So it's also this slippery slope towards an alternative reality world where information is now probably more dangerous than weapons.
Let me
It can
bring
be
Charles-
weaponized very, very quickly.
Very
in
interesting.
the
Let
wrong
me bring
hands, yes.
Charles Emehola in. Charles, of course, the high-tech cyberspace technologist. The issue is digital rights, isn't it? To what extent can the internet be controlled in a way that preserves the rights of the people who are using it? Because you've got governments legislating against freedom of information, access to information, failing to understand what digital rights are, and that the rights that apply to you offline should also apply to you online.
Basically, like he has said, the most crucial thing is actually the source of the information, the source of data. Because like he has said, there could be a lot of bias and unfairness to different people that place across the board in terms of what is happening, election, search of information. For instance, I was going through a McKinsey publication and I saw where a friend of mine posted it on one of the groups that I formed about how data can be biased towards artificial intelligence. Because most times, when you talk about, for instance, in artificial intelligence, you have the unsupervised learning and you have the supervised learning. So for the supervised learning, you have to make do with data sets. And this data set, you have to train the model. So if you are using a data set that is biased and you use it to train the model, at the end of the day, by the time it's now on auto, trying to make its own prediction, it will be biased based on those data that were already, fed in it when it was being, modeled and all that. So that's actually the crucial thing we have to look at, because bias information is dependent on where is the source coming from. Was it manipulated and all that? So it's a very crucial thing.
So the issue of digital rights, in other words, the Nigerian parliament, as we saw there, for instance, was supposed to pass a digital rights bill. They actually did pass that bill, but the president decided not to sign that into law. And it was, even though obviously the legislature had sort of, ended in favor of that law. I mean, do we know why it failed to become law, and all the elements that were inside that rights bill, and perhaps that relates to the point you're making?
Yeah, basically, I have a feeling that it has to do with the fact that everybody has to be very, very careful when it comes to digital information. For instance, the blockchain is a technology that is supposed to make you have a timestamp or a source of where the information is coming on. And this is a new technology. We've heard about how blockchain were used in various cryptographic transactions, and at the end of the day, you find out that there's a loophole somewhere where it's hacked and the rest. So I think they're trying to be very, very cautious on the fact that the security aspect of the cyberspace is very crucial. So if we can get it right in being able to know the source or ability to encrypt data, it's probably won't be an issue for such digital bill to be passed. So I think they're trying to make sure that they get it right. I mean, and how the security aspect of those digital information is going to play out.
But you were supportive of having a digital rights bill?
Yeah, I'm supportive, but it's something that, I mean, we have a lot of things to do in Nigeria. I mean, the awareness, the educational system, we have to actually, change our curriculum so that at a point in time, if you are graduating as a computer engineer or an information technologist, you should have how to secure information at your fingertips, so that at the end of the day, if they put you among committees to deliberate on issues like this, you know how to go about it. So.
Okay, well, let's take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our discussion around Africa's digital revolution. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anier-Golden. Now let's talk about digital colonization. As mentioned previously, online penetration in Africa is patchy, and technology giants like Google and Facebook are busy building up internet infrastructure, circling the continent with huge undersea cables to get millions online. Google's underwater cable plans are already underway, and the first phase should be completed in about 2 years. The new cable will have 20 times the capacity of the most recent projects laid in the region, and will first branch out in Nigeria, which is Africa's biggest internet market. Well, in a moment, I'll be reintroducing my panel of digital and journalistic experts. But first, here's the internet blockchain developer Tope Alabi talking about the big tech companies and data sovereignty at a TEDx event in California.
While Web 2.0 has brought us a long way towards the Internet of I to we still fall short in a few fundamental ways. One example is data sovereignty. So let me ask you a question. When you store that baby picture onto Facebook, who owns that copy of the baby picture? Is it you or is it Facebook? What about all those driving directions that you looked up on Google? Who owns that? Do you own that or does Google own that? The answer is that as of today, Facebook and Google basically control all of the data that you generate on their platforms. This means that for most people, they don't even control their own internet identity. So, another example is international money transfer. How come it's so easy to send text messages and videos to Nigeria, but we still have to rely on Western Union just to send money? I mean, money is just a set of numbers in a database, just like a text message is just a set of letters in a database. So why the difference? Another example is censorship. While the internet is a bastion of free speech for most people, governments routinely block certain websites and sometimes the internet as a whole whenever it interferes with their agenda. Citizens in China cannot access any websites on the country's banned list. The US military blocks its personnel from reading certain news sites. And countries like Cuba, Syria, and Chad will sometimes unplug the entire internet just to keep their citizens from communicating with each other. We are not living the dream of the internet.
And that's Tope Alabi there. Now, with me in the studio, the ICT consultant Femi Adebo, who's also CEO of Comnavig, a company that provides advisory services on a broad range of ICT genres, the high-tech and cyberspace technologist Charles Emehel, and the international journalist and African affairs analyst Lindsay Barrett. And let me come to you, Femi, because as we saw Tope talking there, many parts of Africa, for example, Facebook is the internet. I mean, phones are sold with the internet going through a Facebook app, which serves as a portal to online connectivity. Does that give Facebook too much power?
Well, I think the question of power has already been addressed even in Europe and America, in terms of the power people like Facebook have and their ability to influence major events like elections. But you have to ask yourself one fundamental question. What are these companies? I mean, we all use them. We pretty much can't do without them anymore now in most cases. But when you derive, say, 90% of your revenue from advertising, really, you're an advertising business, using digital tools to enhance that core business. And in both cases, I believe over 90% of revenue comes from adverts. So you mentioned digital colonization in a sense earlier on. And we're a large market. Africa is 1.3 billion people, a lot of resources still under the ground. The more we can prosper, the more money we have. Now the world is integrated, we can shop, we can even lubricate other economies. From here, logistics will bring the goods to us. That's already happening. If you look at the growth, for example, in our web payments between, say, 2014 and to date, it's about fourfold, or three and a half fold. So people are spending, people are shopping. So more people go into the middle class, more advertising revenues can be generated. The means to execute is there in terms of payment systems. The means to deliver is there. So it depends ultimately on the productivity orientation of a society. So as long as we have more of a consumer-centric orientation,
it'll always be to your detriment, whether it's the internet or any other form.
We are colonized again.
That's a good point. Let me bring you in, Lindsay Barrett. Do you have a skeptical view of corporations like Facebook and the internet? Does that give them too much power? Because what if you channel lots of your business, for example, through their portal, and then tomorrow they're no longer there, or if they choose to take you off for whatever reason? I mean, should there be concern and perhaps even fear that there is over-reliance on a few players who are in that space?
Well, I think this seems to be definitely a danger that we must address. But I'd like to say something, Charles. You know, the viability of the internet in Africa is largely dependent upon how it is used and how the younger generation addresses it. In my own home, I've observed that I am almost analog, even though I think I'm quite digital. But when compared to my children, you know, my 19 and 17-year-old daughters, the way they approach the use of they are now banking electronically. I do a bit of that myself, but I still find myself way behind them.
In other words, you see it as extraneous to yourself, whereas they see it as an essential part of
as an essential part of their life. So I look down the road and I say, what needs to be done is for these young men here,
these sort of hot shot
hot
ICT experts,
should begin to look at ways in which they can shape this digital world to suit what is best for their community.
And to do it, strike whilst the iron is hot.
Definitely.
Because if you don't do it now, it'll overtake you and you won't be able to control it.
So when one talks about Facebook, Google, and so on, and their attempt or their ability to colonize the space, I think really what we should be looking at is how do we utilize
take advantage
take advantage.
Right. Okay, let me bring Charles Emeheli in. Sorry, you were going to say something quick.
I wanted to add to that very quickly. And it's such a valid point because the main risk I see, and I'm not sure whether the cat is out of the, or whether it's bolted the hatch already, is cross-cultural confusion. The internet has led us to, I don't mean to criticize the younger generation because they're doing very well in many aspects as well, but the absorption of many cultures that they don't even understand and that don't sit probably with our own culture. And you then have this funny mix which is manifested in all sorts of crazy behavior you see, and you wonder, are you a Nigerian? How can you talk to an elder like that? How can you do this? How can you? But it's what I call the cross-cultural confusion, which is why countries like China limit it. And it's a paradox that anytime we talk about economic development, you say, oh, in China, we try to use China as an example, but we kind of like frown on the kind of like
that's a good
strong
point.
stance
Let me bring
China's
Charles
taken in some
Emeheli
respects.
in. Based on what you've heard so far, increased connectivity, good for Africans, but also good for Facebook and Google in terms of commercial opportunities. But the other argument is that universal internet access is intertwined. Certainly that's the argument of the big tech companies, and I think I have heard hints of that argument here, that it's intertwined with the goals of governments and the people in Africa, which is to create greater economic opportunity for all, including the people, the governments, and the tech giants.
Yeah, I think like we all rightly said, if you control data and you control the people, of course you control the world. For instance, Google, Facebook, what do they have that is giving them? I mean, what resources do they have? They have users and they have data. So if you have a lot of users in your portal and you have data in your portal, you definitely, I mean, even the government will be afraid of you. You understand? So, and if you check very well the trend now, you find out that tech giants like Mark Zuckerberg, of course, of Facebook, and Elon Musk, their businesses are tailored towards giving access to internet globally for free. So you think, okay, if somebody gives internet access for free, global, how is he making revenue?
Yeah, well, it's not free, is it?
Yeah. So, they are looking at, by the time they make the internet free, everybody will want to get into the system.
But that's a very good point you've raised, because these few tech giants, they've taken over the core functionality, as somebody said, of the components of this digital ecosystem, and they are reaping the commercial benefits. And a lot of people are not aware of that. But in South Africa, for instance, I was looking at the figures last night. I understand that Google takes 70% of local online advertising spent on social media. And then you've got Facebook taking another 12%. South Africa's major media groups take just 8% of the pie. Is that cause for concern? We've got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, sure. It calls for for concern. It's like a wake-up call for Africans, for our government to also give, because how do these tech giants start? They come up with ideas and government give them a lot of incentive, encourage them, empower them, and they come up with a lot of innovations and even go beyond their borders. But here in Nigeria and Africa, you see somebody coming up and you don't even like to encourage them. Because I tell you what, Larry Page of Google, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg, these are the 3 people to watch globally. And of course, Amazon is coming on, Jack Bezos and all that. So at the end of the day, what they have is data and users.
Okay.
And these are the new resources, the new currency.
Right, we'll talk about that some more in a moment. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead as we continue our discussion about online penetration and the digital revolution in Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyagolo, and today we are looking at Africa's digital revolution. It is fair to say that the internet has brought largely beneficial changes and rapid growth to Africa, but is there a downside? For instance, is the lack of development in the continent's digital infrastructure giving the tech giants too much power? And what about the absence of laws on digital privacy and data protection? And if it is uncontrolled, what power does the internet give African governments to conduct surveillance of their citizens? With me in the studio, the ICT consultant, Femi Adebo, who's also CEO of Comnavig, a company that provides advisory services on a broad range of ICT genres, the high-tech and cyberspace technologist, Charles Emehel, and the international journalist and African affairs analyst, Lindsay Barrett. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And let me come to you, Lindsay, because we've been talking generally about internet, the advantages and so on. But is the kind of access that we're seeing in other parts of the world still limited to a privileged few in Africa? This type of internet connectivity, is it still patchy on the continent?
Well, I think it is, Charles, and it's of course in countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa in the southern part of the continent, it's much more universal than in some of the neighboring countries. For example, I've just come back from Sierra Leone, where the difference between even mobile connectivity, mobile phone connectivity between Nigeria and Sierra Leone is so vast, it's remarkable. When you realize, I mean, in Sierra Leone you buy time, you don't buy a card. You don't load yourself, somebody loads you. You know, there's differences. So I imagine that what is really happening is that, as some of the gentlemen on the panel said, the drivers of the technology take advantage of where there is commercial, you know, there are commercial benefits.
Which is to be expected, I suppose.
Naturally.
Yeah.
And that can lead to imbalances across the continent. But the major problem I find is that here in Africa, we have not regulated enough. There is not enough regulation in Europe or elsewhere. They have complained about it. But here we have not
done anything at all.
About
right.
it. We have done nothing at all.
And we were talking about that a moment ago, that the president refused to sign that digital rights bill, and the ostensible reason was that the scope of the bill, according to him, should be limited to the protection of human rights within the digital environment to reduce what he called the challenge of duplication and legislative conflict in the future. So the bill at the moment is stuck in the mud, and you were saying something about that.
Well, I was saying, you know, we have some laws that deal directly with cyber conduct, principally the Cybercrime Act. So to my mind, there may be components that are duplicated. We also have the, should I say, lack of an ICT policy. One was put together in 2012, as I was explaining, but for whatever reason, it was approved in principle by the former president. Anyway, we really don't have a modern ICT policy document. And your policy is your statement of intent. It's the ground norm. It's the, everything then picks from it. So, but at least that policy gives you that harmonized,
right. But does that underscore
framework.
what Lindsay was saying, that there is still a kind of
there's a vacuum,
age sort of gap between people who make these laws and the people who are actually using the internet much more, and for some reason they don't quite understand the impact that this is having.
I don't think that's
Right.
the issue with Nigeria. I think you'd be very surprised that some of the Lizzie's old generation actually are quite nifty on their. They conduct their lives on their iPads and their laptops. Yeah, I've seen 80-year-olds. My mother is 80 this month. She communicates on WhatsApp. We send pictures. I mean, they've kind of like tuned in. But from a governance perspective, which I presume is what you're saying, I don't think so. I think what's happened is conflicts of, should I say, interest in a sense. There are many fiefdoms. If you do this, it takes away a bit of power from that person,
Right.
so they push. If you do that, it may take away from that, so they push. And it would take very strong governments to say, look, without coming across as authoritarian.
Right.
I mean, if it's China, nobody questions it. If it's North Korea, it's not a discussion point. But here, we are, we're in the age of free expression and what have you. So it would take a strong government to say, look, come, we need one set of rules. And these are the rules. You're entitled to free speech, but you're not entitled to your own facts.
Right.
You're entitled to your opinion, but you can't manufacture your own facts and say Charles Ayongolu was walking upside down, and then I put it out there and say, as forward.
I'd like to be able to walk upside down.
Sure you
That'll
will.
be fun. But let me bring Charles Emeheli in. I mean, go on.
Yeah, I think in my own opinion, sometimes if we've checked the history of Nigeria about policies and documents, we find out that most times we don't even have problem in bringing our policies and white papers and the rest. Where we always have issue is in implementation.
Yes.
And now implementation, the challenges we have in implementation is because personally, I know from experience in the industry that there's a lot of lack of capacity. And that is why this implementation doesn't see the light of the day most times.
Right.
For instance, you will set up committees and the rest to see into implementation, and at the end of the day, if somebody have interest in a particular personnel being part of it because of probably the huge amounts that will come in there. But you see one IT consultant somewhere that knows how all these things work, and they will never engage him.
Yeah. Okay. We've
so-
got a few minutes left. Let me bring Lindsay Barrett in again because I want to get to that point of, first of all, you've got to have a huge base, number of people who are online, and that is what these tech giants are doing, putting these huge cables and trying to get as many people online because they clearly see the potential in Africa. I understand that globally the number of people online is about 50%. And in Africa, it's about 20%, 25% or so. And within Africa itself, there are deep internet inequalities. I mean, in South Africa, you have about 60% of people online. Ivory Coast has 45% or so. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have countries like Liberia, Eritrea, and Chad, for instance, which have less than 10%. I mean, so that sort of digital divide, is that apparent in Nigeria as well?
Yes and no. Let me say, I think Nigeria has a very high percentage of telephone users, mobile phone users. But the divide is between what people do with their instruments.
And also there are a lot of
with their
analog phone
devices.
users, let's face
There
it.
a lot of us are, I don't use Facebook, I can tell you that right now. But not because I wasn't on it, because
You got bored.
no, I got scared.
Okay, right.
I can tell you that when my daughter put me on Facebook, the first messages I got were from some old schoolmates of mine who I didn't like at all in school. And they were sending me messages, one of them from Australia, saying, "Is that you?" You know. But at the same time,
And you were like, oh no, not you.
It exposes you. in a way.
It does
now,
expose you.
but you see, but a lot of the users in Nigeria don't live in Nigeria at all. I can tell you, my children are virtually living with their relatives in Jamaica and Canada. They converse with them more than they converse with their classmates. So this is something that is happening that has great potential, but which, as my friend here says, needs to be regulated.
Right, okay.
And we're not regulating.
On that note, I want to thank you very much indeed, Lindsay Barrett, the international journalist and African affairs analyst, Femi Adebo, CEO of Comnavig, and of course, Charles Emehelo, the high-tech and cyberspace technologist. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.